You're standing in a quiet room where footsteps instinctively slow, not because anyone told you to, but because the air itself seems to ask for restraint. The light is soft and deliberate, filtered through glass and distance, designed to protect objects that have outlived empires. In front of you is a clay tablet, not large, not dramatic, the kind of artifact most people walk past without ever stopping. A rectangle of baked earth, its surface pressed with tiny wedge-shaped marks that look almost decorative at first glance. Harmless, ancient, safe, the label beneath it offers comfort. A creation myth. Religious symbolism. A glimpse into how early humans tried to explain their world. It's neat, contained. Nothing here to trouble the modern mind. But lean closer. Let your eyes follow the grooves. These marks weren't carved for beauty. They were impressed with intention, line after line, by someone recording something that mattered enough to preserve. There's a rhythm to the writing, a precision. It doesn't wander the way poetry wanders. It doesn't bloom the way stories meant to inspire faith usually do. It lists, it categorizes, it pauses where a scribe needed to be exact. And that's when the discomfort begins. Because what you're reading doesn't feel like a myth trying to explain existence. It feels like documentation. Not a story about how humans came to be, but a record of how something was attempted, evaluated, and adjusted, over and over again. You've been taught that ancient people spoke only in symbols, that they lacked the language for analysis, for process, for failure in the modern sense. But the lines on this tablet don't behave that way. They describe outcomes. They note defects. They acknowledge results that didn't work. Beings that couldn't grasp tools. Beings that couldn't see. Beings that couldn't reproduce. Forms that didn't fit their intended purpose. That's a strange way to talk about divine creation. If this were mythology in the comforting sense, you'd expect archetypes. Gods forming humans in a single decisive act. A clean origin. Instead, you find repetition, variation, correction, the quiet implication that something went wrong the first time and the time after that. Consider how unfamiliar that idea should feel. Most origin stories begin with perfection lost later, a fall, a corruption. But here, imperfection comes first. Success arrives only after multiple failures. That's not the logic of religion. That's the logic of development. You might tell yourself this is just your modern mind projecting patterns where none exist, that you're imposing engineering language onto spiritual texts. But the tablet resists that dismissal. The structure doesn't allow for it. The sequence matters. The defects are specific. And most unsettling of all, the text doesn't seem embarrassed by failure. It records it calmly, almost indifferently, as if trial and error were expected. Think about that for a moment. What kind of worldview accepts failed creations as part of the process? Not one centered on omnipotence, not one obsessed with perfection. This reads like the work of beings who solve problems, not gods who speak reality into existence with a word. Beings who adjust inputs, who refine methods, who accept that the first outcome might not meet requirements. And suddenly, the tablet stops being small. It becomes heavy, not physically, but conceptually. Because if this text is taken even slightly more literally than we're comfortable with, it suggests something radical. That humanity wasn't the result of a single moment of divine inspiration, but the endpoint of a sequence, a version number rather than an origin. What if creation wasn't an event, but a process? What if the language of clay and blood and breath was the only vocabulary available to describe something far more technical? Something that, if written today, would use words like iteration, optimization, rejection. You don't have to believe that. Not yet. You only have to notice how the text behaves, how it refuses to sit neatly in the category it's been assigned, how it feels closer to a logbook than a legend. And notice something else too. The tablet doesn't linger on triumph. It doesn't celebrate humanity with reverence. It doesn't marvel at consciousness or beauty or destiny. Its focus is narrower, more practical. Did the being function? Could it work? Could it fulfill the role it was made for? That's an uncomfortable question to encounter at the supposed dawn of humanity, because it quietly reframes what creation means. Not the birth of a beloved species, but the deployment of a solution. A response to a problem that existed before humans ever did. As you stand there, the room remains silent. No alarms go off. No curator rushes over to correct your thoughts. The tablet doesn't glow or hum. It simply sits, doing what it has done for thousands of years, waiting to be read carefully. And the longer you look, the more another realization settles in. This tablet doesn't explain who we are. It explains why we were needed. That's a subtle but profound difference. If that's true, then this isn't the beginning of a comforting story. It's the opening page of something far more unsettling. A narrative where humanity is not the central intention, but the outcome of repeated attempts to solve someone else's problem. You step back eventually. Everyone does. The glass puts the tablet safely out of reach again. The label reassumes its authority. Creation myth, ancient belief, nothing to worry about. But the question lingers, quietly, insistently. What if the first thing ever recorded about us wasn't who we were meant to be, but what went wrong before we finally worked? Once you allow that thought to exist, just briefly, just as a possibility, the rest of the story rearranges itself around it. The tablet no longer feels isolated. It starts to feel like the first page of a much longer record, one that doesn't begin with humans at all. Before there were people, the texts say there was work. Not metaphorical work, not spiritual striving, actual labor, digging canals, lifting earth, redirecting rivers, maintaining the infrastructure of a world that was already functioning, already inhabited by beings who had names, hierarchies, rivalries, and limits. The world wasn't created for humans. Humans were created for the world. The stories describe a time when the gods themselves did this labor. Junior deities, tasked with the physical burdens of shaping the land, sustaining the systems that made civilization possible for their superiors. 4 years, decades. According to the texts, they endured it, until they didn't. The rebellion of the Agigi isn't dramatic in the way modern myths tend to be. There's no grand speech about freedom or justice. Instead, there's exhaustion, resentment. A breaking point reached after too long carrying a load that was never meant to be permanent. They burn their tools. That detail matters. Tools represent function, purpose, role. Burning them isn't just protest, it's refusal, a declaration that the system itself is broken. And suddenly, the divine world has a problem, not a moral problem, a logistical one. Someone has to do the work. This is where creation enters the story, and not as an act of wonder, but as a solution proposed in a meeting. The texts describe discussion, debate, disagreement, different personalities pushing different outcomes. One voice argues for punishment, another for compromise, and one suggests something entirely new. Replace the workers. Think about how stark that idea is. Not fix the system, not improve conditions, not reconcile, just substitute. Create a being designed from the outset to do what the others refused to continue doing. This isn't the language of mythic love. It's the language of management. The being envisioned isn't meant to rule or question or transcend. It's meant to carry, to dig, to maintain, to absorb the burden so others no longer have to. The texts are unambiguous about this. Humanity is created to assume the drudgery of the gods. That's not an insult in the ancient context. It's a function statement. And functions require specifications. If you've ever watched something being truly built, from scratch, you know the process never starts with perfection. There are prototypes. Early versions that reveal flaws you couldn't predict on paper. Adjustments that only become obvious once something exists in the real world. Failures that teach you more than successes ever could. Now imagine that process being described by people who didn't have words like engineering or biology or genetics. They used the language they had: clay, blood, breath, wombs, gestation. But the structure of the story underneath those words feels eerily familiar. A material is selected. Not just any material, but a specific one, from a specific place. A sacrifice is made, not as symbolism, but as a transfer of properties, intelligence, awareness, something essential that can't be generated from Earth alone. The result is tested. And here's where the discomfort deepens. Because the texts don't treat early humans as children or miracles. They treat them as outcomes. The question isn't, are they sacred? It's, do they work? Some don't. Some can't hold tools. Some can't navigate the environment. Some can't reproduce, threatening the sustainability of the system. Some exist in ways that don't fit the intended binary structure. These aren't moral failings, they're incompatibilities. In a religious framework, difference is sacred. In a technical framework, difference is a variable, and variables that destabilize a system get flagged. What's striking is that the stories don't rush past these details. They linger, they catalogue. They record what was done with each outcome. Repurposed, reassigned, discarded, improved. That's not how myths usually behave. Myths explain why the world is the way it is. This explains why certain attempts weren't kept. At some point, the process yields something stable enough, functional enough, a version that meets the minimum requirements. The labor problem is solved. The system resumes. The gods rest. And you might expect the story to end there. Creation achieved. Balance restored. But it doesn't. Because systems don't fail immediately. They fail over time, under scale, under stress, under growth. And that's exactly what happens next. Humans multiply. They become numerous, loud, present. Their existence, once a solution, becomes a complication. Noise becomes a metaphor, but not a poetic one. Noise is interference. It's what happens when a system produces too much activity for its controllers to manage comfortably. Attempts are made to correct this. Plagues, droughts, famine. Each one reduces the population temporarily, but not enough. The system rebounds. The noise returns. This is the moment where the idea of a single, loving creation breaks down completely. Because what follows isn't guidance or enlightenment. It's escalation, a reset. Not because humanity is evil, not because it has sinned, but because it has exceeded acceptable parameters. It has become too numerous, too independent, too difficult to manage with the constraints of the original design. And that raises a question that's hard to ignore once it forms. If humans were created to solve a problem, what happens when the solution creates a bigger one? You can feel the story tightening here, even if the texts don't say it outright. Because resets aren't emotional decisions. They're last resorts when optimization fails. As you let that idea settle, something becomes clear. The creation story isn't about where we came from. It's about how a system responds when its own creation behaves in unexpected ways. And suddenly, the idea of humanity being created twice doesn't sound mystical at all. It sounds procedural. If the creation of humanity were truly a single, finished act, the ancient record would settle into silence after that moment. There would be no reason to keep writing, no need for clarification, no uncomfortable addendums tucked into lesser-known texts. Success stories don't usually require footnotes. But here, the story keeps going, and more tellingly, it branches. One strand presents a clean narrative. Humanity is created. The labor problem is solved. Order is restored. This is the version most people encounter first, because it's easier to digest. It has a beginning, a middle, and a resolution. A story that can be taught without raising too many questions. But another strand exists alongside it, quieter and less triumphant. It doesn't contradict the first version outright. It complicates it. And complication is often where the truth hides. In this second account, creation isn't framed as a flawless success. It's framed as an experiment that didn't always behave as expected. The text opens not with wonder, but with tension. A celebration among the gods. Yes, but celebrations can be dangerous things. They lower guards, they loosen tongues, they invite comparison. Pride slips in where caution should have stayed. A challenge is issued, not to destroy humanity, but to test it. One deity claims authority over form, over the shaping of bodies and functions. Another claims authority over wisdom, over adaptation, over finding use where none seems possible. What follows isn't a battle in the heroic sense. It's a demonstration, a proof of concept. One by one, new beings are formed, and each one is wrong. Not morally wrong, structurally wrong, unable to perform some essential function that the system depends on. A being whose hands cannot grasp, a being who cannot see, a being whose body betrays itself in ways that make social integration impossible, a being who cannot reproduce, threatening continuity, a being who doesn't fit neatly into categories the system was built around. The text doesn't rush through these creations. It pauses on each one, describing the limitation clearly before moving on. This isn't metaphorical shorthand, it's inspection. What happens next is often softened in modern retellings, but the original tone is remarkably practical. Each flawed being is assessed, a role is assigned where possible, a workaround is implemented, a solution is found not out of compassion, but out of necessity. This is important, because it shows that failure wasn't unexpected, it was anticipated. The system allowed for it. The process continued anyway, until it didn't. The final creation in this sequence is different, not flawed in a single dimension, but broken at a foundational level, unable to communicate, unable to sustain itself, unable to interact meaningfully with the world at all. The text struggles to describe it. Language starts to fray. It isn't alive in any functional sense. But it isn't dead either. It exists in a liminal state, beyond remediation. And here, something unprecedented happens. The process stops, not because a moral line has been crossed, but because optimization has reached a hard limit. There's nothing left to adjust, no variable to tweak, no role to assign. This version cannot be made to work. And that admission matters, because it introduces the idea that creation has constraints, that even powerful beings encounter outcomes they cannot fix, that some attempts must be abandoned entirely. In mythology, gods rarely admit defeat. Here, defeat is documented. You might be tempted to read this as a symbolic meditation on disability or human diversity. And that interpretation has merit. Ancient societies needed ways to understand difference, to integrate those who didn't fit expected roles. But that reading doesn't explain the structure of the narrative. This isn't a population story. It's not describing natural variation among many humans. It's describing individual instances created sequentially, evaluated individually, and responded to in real time. That's the detail that doesn't sit comfortably. If this were a moral allegory, you'd expect broad categories. Instead, you get case studies, specific outcomes tied to specific interventions. That's not how metaphor usually works. That's how process documentation works. And then, abruptly, the tone shifts. The text doesn't resolve the tension with wisdom or forgiveness. It simply ends the sequence, as if someone closed a file, as if what followed belonged to a different phase entirely. And perhaps it did, because after this point, the record grows strangely quiet about early humanity. There's a gap, a missing chapter, a sense that something has been omitted rather than concluded. What you're left with is an unsettling implication, that the beings described in this second account aren't ancestors in the traditional sense. They're iterations, early versions that taught their creators what wouldn't work, which raises a question the text never answers directly. If these were prototypes, what happened to them? They don't appear later as communities. They don't evolve. They don't integrate. They simply vanish from the narrative. And narratives usually don't erase things without reason. As you sit with that silence, another realization emerges. The first creation story celebrates success because it needs to. The second one exists because success was incomplete. Together, they suggest something neither says outright, that humanity, as we know it, may not be the original design but the refined one. Silence in ancient records is rarely accidental. When a story stops abruptly, when a sequence of events fades without resolution, it often means something too large, too destructive, or too disruptive to describe directly has intervened. In this case, the gap left behind by the vanished prototypes doesn't feel like forgetfulness. It feels like erasure. The next time humanity appears clearly in the narrative, the world itself has changed. Water dominates the story, not as a gentle symbol of renewal, but as an overwhelming force, rising, consuming, resetting boundaries that once defined land and life. This flood isn't framed as moral correction in its earliest forms. It's framed as necessity, a response to a system that has grown unstable. The language is strikingly procedural. A warning is issued to a single individual, not because he is virtuous in a modern ethical sense, but because he is described as wise, capable of understanding instructions and following them precisely. Dimensions are specified, materials are listed, timeframes are implied. This isn't prayer, it's preparation. And preparation suggests foreknowledge. Think about how unusual that is. If this was simply a story about divine anger, destruction would come without notice. But here, survival depends on compliance with a plan that assumes most of humanity will not survive, and that this outcome is acceptable. This is where the idea of a reset stops feeling metaphorical, because resets don't preserve everything. They preserve seeds, samples, minimum viable populations, enough to start again without carrying forward the instability of what came before. Across cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, this same structure repeats. A warning, a vessel, a narrowing of life to a manageable remnant, and afterward, a different world. Not just cleaner, but quieter, less crowded, more controllable. Now, step outside the texts for a moment. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth experienced a shock. Not gradual climate drift, but abrupt disruption. Temperatures dropped violently, ice advanced, ecosystems collapsed. Species that had survived for hundreds of thousands of years vanished in a geological instant. Human populations plummeted to a fraction of their former size. Genetics remembers this, even when stories blur. The diversity you would expect from a long, stable population simply isn't there. Instead, there's a narrowing, a bottleneck. Evidence that all modern humans descend from a surprisingly small group of survivors. This isn't controversial. What's unsettling is how neatly it aligns with the flood narratives. Massive fires precede the cold. Forests burn on a continental scale. Ash settles into sediment layers like a signature. Then comes water released, not gently, but catastrophically, as ice melts faster than landscapes can absorb. Sea levels surge. Habitable zones vanish. The world becomes hostile to complex life almost overnight. If you were trying to erase a population without leaving obvious architectural scars, this is how nature would do it, or how it would appear to be done. The flood, then, stops being a story about punishment. It becomes a transition point. The dividing line between versions. Before the water, one kind of humanity exists. After it, something subtly different emerges. The texts even hint at this. After the waters recede, the gods don't simply promise restraint. They implement controls, limits on reproduction, shortened lifespans, built-in fragility, mechanisms to prevent unchecked growth from happening again. That's a strange outcome for a moral tale, but it makes sense in a systems narrative. You fix the bug by changing the parameters. What's haunting is how calmly this is described. There's no grief for the erased world, no mourning for what was lost, just acceptance that the slate has been wiped and that the next iteration must be more manageable. And then something unexpected happens. Instead of a slow, painful recovery from near extinction, humanity accelerates. Within a geological blink, agriculture appears in multiple places. Settlements form, knowledge proliferates, tools improve. Symbolic thought explodes into architecture and ritual. This isn't how species usually behave after collapse. Trauma tends to fragment cultures. It doesn't synchronize them. Unless memory survived, not necessarily written memory, not libraries or blueprints, but something deeper. Patterns, instincts, echoes of what once worked and what didn't. If the flood was the line between attempts, then everything that follows carries a quiet question. Is this the first time humanity has stood here? Or is it the first time we've stood here again? When you look closely at the aftermath of that reset, what stands out isn't how little survived, but how much did. This is the part of the story that resists easy explanation. After a catastrophe powerful enough to scorch continents, freeze climates, and erase entire species, you would expect humanity to stumble forward slowly, cautiously, almost blindly. You would expect generations of recovery before anything resembling complexity could emerge again. That isn't what the record shows. Instead, what follows the Great Rupture is an acceleration so abrupt it feels out of place, like a scene skipped ahead without warning. Across the world, in regions that had never been connected by trade or language, the same transformation begins almost at once. Humans stop wandering. They settle, they cultivate, they build. Agriculture appears, not as a single discovery that spreads outward over millennia, but as multiple beginnings unfolding within a narrow window of time. Wheat and barley in one region, rice and millet in another, maize elsewhere, different plants, different animals, the same shift in behavior. That coincidence is usually explained as inevitability. Climate stabilized, Conditions improved. Humans adapted. It's a comforting narrative because it makes progress feel automatic, almost destined. But inevitability doesn't explain precision. Domestication isn't obvious. It requires foresight, selective breeding over generations. An understanding, however, intuitive, cycles, seasons, inheritance. Hunter-gatherers had lived alongside these plants and animals for tens of thousands of years without turning them into agriculture. Then, suddenly, they do, everywhere, at the same time. And agriculture is only the beginning. Permanent structures follow, storage systems, social hierarchies, specialized roles, symbolic architecture that serves no immediate survival function at all. This isn't survival behavior, it's remembrance. Civilization doesn't feel like something being invented here. It feels like something being resumed. Consider how quickly complexity stacks. Writing systems appear not long after the first cities. Mathematics advances beyond what subsistent societies strictly require. Astronomy becomes precise enough to track cycles that unfold over generations. Calendars align human activity with celestial motion. None of this is necessary to stay alive. It's necessary to manage something already known to be fragile. As if the survivors understood, on some deep level, that the world could end suddenly. That cycles mattered. That memory had to be externalized, in stone, in symbols, in ritual, because relying on living memory alone had already failed once. What's unsettling is not that humans became clever. It's how coordinated that cleverness appears in hindsight. And then there are the structures. Monuments rise that demand planning, labor organization, and shared meaning. Not shelters, not fortifications, statements, markers, places built to be seen by future generations. Some of them shouldn't exist at all, given their age, before metal tools, before beasts of burden, before wheels. Massive stones are quarried, shaped, transported, and erected with care. Their surfaces carved with animals that no longer roam the earth. Their alignments tied to the sky. These aren't experiments, they're confident acts. It's difficult to escape the feeling that the people building them knew exactly what they were doing, that they weren't guessing, that they weren't discovering architecture for the first time. They were executing a plan whose logic had already been tested. And this brings you back to the flood narratives, to the idea of preservation. Boats carrying not just bodies, but knowledge, seeds, instructions. The minimum required to restart a world without starting from ignorance. If that sounds too literal, step back again. Think of memory not as stories told around fires, but as behaviors passed down so consistently they feel instinctive. The urge to measure, to record, to align human life with the sky, to build in stone rather than wood, as if permanence suddenly mattered more than comfort. If humanity nearly vanished once, permanence would become an obsession. The official explanation says these similarities are coincidences, parallel solutions to parallel problems. But parallel problems don't usually produce parallel timelines with this level of synchronization, unless the problem was global, unless the solution was remembered. This is where the idea of a second creation grows quieter and more disturbing, because it doesn't require God's returning with tools or ships. It only requires that something survived the reset intact enough to guide what came next. That something could be people, or it could be patterns embedded so deeply they feel like intuition, or it could be knowledge preserved in forms we don't recognize as technological because we expect technology to look like machines. Either way, what emerges after the catastrophe doesn't look like a beginning. It looks like a continuation under constraints, and constraints imply design. There is one place where that sense of continuation becomes almost impossible to ignore. A place that sits uncomfortably in the timeline, like a sentence that appears before the paragraph that's supposed to explain it. You don't arrive there through myth first. You arrive through stone. Massive blocks, carved with intent, arranged with precision, standing in deliberate patterns that refuse to be dismissed as accidental. The site doesn't announce itself as a city. It doesn't look like a village. There are no defensive walls, no hearths meant for daily life, no signs of gradual expansion from something smaller. It appears fully formed. The age alone is enough to unsettle the narrative you've been given. More than 11,000 years old, older than pottery, older than metal, older than agriculture, at least according to the sequence you were taught in school. According to that sequence, people at this time should have been small bands of foragers, focused entirely on survival, with little reason or ability to invest in projects that required coordination on such a scale. And yet, here it is. Circular enclosures, monolithic pillars weighing tens of tons, carvings so precise they capture motion, anatomy, and intention. Animals rendered with familiarity, not reverence. Predators, prey, creatures that once shared the landscape with humans, but would soon disappear forever. What kind of society builds something like this? Not one that is just discovering itself. To raise stones of that size, you need planning. To plan, you need shared knowledge. To share knowledge, you need language refined enough to transmit complex ideas across generations. To commit to a project that offers no immediate survival advantage, you need a reason that transcends hunger and shelter. You need memory. The site doesn't feel experimental. There's no sense of trial and error in its construction. The pillars are consistent in shape. The layouts follow repeating principles. The symbolism isn't chaotic. It's coherent, as if drawn from a system already understood. And then there's the decision that comes later. After centuries of use, the entire complex is deliberately buried, not abandoned, not destroyed by enemies. Buried carefully, layer by layer, as if someone wanted to ensure it would survive intact beneath the soil. This isn't how cultures usually treat their most important spaces. They repair them, they rebuild, or they let them decay. Burying something is an act of intention. It suggests preservation, or concealment, or a message meant for a future that could not yet receive it. The official explanation offers ritual closure, that sites are sometimes symbolically ended when their purpose is fulfilled. It's a neat answer. It keeps the story contained. But it doesn't explain why this site existed in the first place. Because if you accept the standard progression, agriculture first, surplus second, specialization third, then this place is an anomaly. It reverses the sequence entirely. It implies that gathering, ritual, and shared meaning came before farming. That people organized themselves around something abstract before they organized food production. Unless food production was already understood. Unless the knowledge existed, waiting for conditions to allow it to re-emerge. Look at what follows this period. Shortly after this site is abandoned, agriculture spreads, settlements appear, complexity accelerates. It's as if whatever was being done here had accomplished its purpose. As if this place was a bridge. If you allow yourself to think dangerously for a moment, a different picture forms. Not of humanity inventing civilization, but of humanity remembering it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to restart. The carvings begin to feel less like decoration and more like record. The animals less like symbols and more like witnesses. The alignment with the sky less like worship and more like calibration. A way of anchoring human life to cycles that had once turned hostile. Because if the world had ended once before, if fire had fallen from the sky, ice had surged, water had erased coastlines, then watching the heavens would no longer be spiritual curiosity. It would be survival strategy. And that brings you back to the idea you've been circling since the beginning. If this is humanity after a reset, then this place doesn't mark our birth. It marks our return. Once that possibility takes hold, it starts to color everything that follows. The rise of civilization no longer looks like a miracle of progress. It looks like a controlled release, as if something held back was allowed to flow again slowly at first, then faster, once stability was confirmed. You begin to notice a pattern repeating across cultures that, by all conventional measures, should not have been in contact. Not just similar ideas, but similar sequences. First survival, then teaching, then structure. Again and again, the stories speak of figures who appear after catastrophe, not creators, but instructors. Beings who arrive when the world is still raw and uncertain, bringing order rather than origin. They don't create humanity, they refine it. They teach agriculture, they teach writing, they teach law, measurement, astronomy. Always the same domains, always the knowledge required to build stable, scalable societies. Not art for art's sake, but systems. What's striking is how these figures are described. They are rarely portrayed as distant gods in the sky. They walk among humans, they speak, they demonstrate, they correct. Their presence is temporary. Once the knowledge takes root, they leave. This isn't how myth usually treats gods. Gods demand worship. They linger. They intervene constantly. These figures do something else entirely. They install frameworks and step away. If you strip away the symbolism, what remains is a transfer of expertise, and expertise implies prior experience. Across regions, these instructors emerge with suspicious timing just after humanity begins to recover from near collapse. When populations are small enough to manage, when memory of disaster is still fresh, when social structures are flexible enough to accept new rules. The timing is perfect. You might say this is coincidence, that cultures naturally personify the abstract process of learning, that these figures are metaphors for collective human ingenuity, and perhaps they are, but metaphors usually differ. These don't, they carry the same traits. They arrive from the water or the sky. They possess knowledge humans don't yet have. They impose order, and they leave behind civilizations that suddenly know how to count, how to plan, how to build. It's as if the second version of humanity didn't start from ignorance, but from amnesia. And amnesia behaves differently than innocence. An innocent mind explores randomly. An amnesiac mind reconstructs. It rebuilds familiar structures even when it can't remember why they feel right. That might explain the strange uniformity of early civilizations, why cities across the world adopt similar layouts, why monumental architecture echoes the same forms, why pyramids, stepped platforms, and sacred enclosures appear independently, yet follow comparable logic, not copying, but remembering. And memory doesn't have to be conscious to be powerful. It can live in ritual, in taboo, in the way certain actions feel inevitable even when their origin is forgotten. If the first version of humanity failed by growing too numerous, too noisy, too difficult to manage, then the second version would need constraints, limits, structures that channel behavior before it becomes chaotic. Laws do that. Calendars do that. Hierarchies do that. Civilization, seen this way, isn't liberation. It's containment. And that reframes one of the most basic assumptions we make about progress. We tend to think complexity arises because it's better. But what if it arose because it was safer? easier to monitor, easier to regulate, easier to predict. A dispersed species is hard to control. A settled one leaves records. Writing, then, becomes more than communication. It becomes traceability, accounting, memory externalized so it can be reviewed, corrected, and enforced. Once you start seeing civilization through that lens, it becomes difficult to unsee. The pieces fit too neatly. The timing aligns too well. The stories repeat with too much consistency. And yet, there's no smoking gun, no inscription that says, explicitly, this is the second attempt. No artifact labeled reset. Instead, there's a convergence. Myth pointing in one direction, geology in another, genetics in a third. None of them definitive alone. Together, unsettling. As if the truth, whatever it is, exists in the overlap. And that overlap suggests something humbling. That humanity might not be the first intelligent species to walk this earth, or even the first version of itself. That we might be inheritors, not originators. Participants in a longer experiment whose initial parameters we don't fully understand. If that's true, then the question isn't just where we came from. It's how closely we're following a script we didn't write. At this point in the story, the idea of a second creation no longer feels distant or abstract. It starts to feel personal, because if humanity truly emerged from a reset, then the evidence shouldn't live only in myths or stones or sediment layers. It should live in us, and in a subtle way, it does. Modern genetics tells a story that is both precise and strangely quiet. When scientists trace human ancestry backward through mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome lineages, they don't find a broad, stable population stretching endlessly into the past. They find narrowing, constriction, a sharp reduction in diversity that shouldn't exist if our species had expanded smoothly over hundreds of thousands of years. At some point, not that long ago, in evolutionary terms, humanity passed through a bottleneck so severe that everyone alive today descends from a surprisingly small group of survivors. That alone isn't controversial. What's unsettling is when that genetic narrowing lines up with everything else. With the climatic collapse, with the disappearance of megafauna, with the abrupt end of entire tool-making traditions, with the sudden silence in the archaeological record where thriving cultures once stood. A bottleneck isn't just loss, it's selection. Traits disappear, others become fixed. Entire possibilities vanish simply because the people who carried them didn't survive. What emerges afterward isn't a continuation of what came before, but a filtered version. Humanity reduced, refined, constrained by chance, saw by design. And constraints leave fingerprints. We are remarkably uniform for a species spread across an entire planet. The differences we emphasize skin tone, facial structure, cultural expression are surface variations. Beneath them, our genetic diversity is low. Lower than you'd expect for a species that has supposedly been stable for so long. It's as if something pressed us through a narrow gate. That narrowing might explain more than survival. It might explain limitation. Short lifespans compared to what ancient texts attribute to pre-flood figures. Reduced physical robustness. A nervous system finely tuned for anxiety, vigilance, and social regulation. If the first version of humanity failed because it became too noisy, too numerous, too independent, then the second version would need built-in brakes, mortality, fragility, psychological traits that favor cooperation over rebellion. Fear, then, isn't a flaw. It's a control mechanism. So is the need for structure, for authority, for meaning imposed from above. These aren't accidents of culture. They may be deep responses to a world that once ended without warning. Trauma shapes behavior. Collective trauma shapes species. Now think back to the myths again. After the flood, the gods don't simply promise restraint. They outline changes, infertility, infant mortality, limits on reproduction, roles that remove certain individuals from the gene pool entirely. Read symbolically, this is morality. Read structurally, it's population management. And suddenly, the line between myth and memory blurs. Because memory doesn't need to be accurate to be useful. It only needs to preserve the lesson. Don't grow too fast. Don't spread too far. Don't forget who controls the system. If that lesson was learned the hard way once, it would echo forward, not as knowledge, but as instinct. And that raises a quiet, uncomfortable question. What if the second version of humanity isn't just defined by what it gained, but by what it lost? What if there were capacities the first version had that we no longer do? Lifespans, resilience, perception. Perhaps not in the supernatural sense, but in ways we no longer recognize because we've never experienced them. When ancient texts speak of beings who lived for thousands of years, we call it exaggeration. But what if it's misinterpreted scale, different measures, different biological limits, or simply a memory of a humanity that was not yet constrained? You don't need to believe that to feel the weight of the idea, because even without gods or experiments, the evidence still points to interruption, to a moment when continuity broke and something new emerged, carrying echoes of what came before but unable to fully recover it. That's what makes the question of a second creation so unsettling. It doesn't require belief in external creators. It only requires acceptance that humanity may not be a straight line, that we are, in some sense, survivors of a version that didn't make it. And survivors always carry ghosts. Once you start seeing humanity as a survivor rather than a beginning, the present begins to look different, too. Not because the past suddenly explains everything, but because it introduces a pattern and patterns invite comparison. If there was a first version of humanity that failed, the question is no longer whether resets can happen. It's why they happen. The ancient stories are remarkably consistent on this point. The problem was never evil in the moral sense. It was scale, growth without restraint, noise, activity exceeding tolerance. The system didn't collapse because humans were wicked. It collapsed because they were too successful. That's a dangerous idea, because it mirrors something uncomfortably familiar. For the first time since the Great Catastrophe, humanity has become planetary again. Not in numbers alone, but in impact. Our actions affect climate, ecosystems, and even the chemistry of the atmosphere. We extract, transform, and reorganize the world at a pace no previous civilization ever achieved. In other words, we're approaching the same thresholds, just through different means. The myths say the gods grew tired of the noise. But noise doesn't have to mean sound. It can mean interference, unpredictability, systems behaving outside expected parameters. When a creation begins to act independently, to alter its environment in ways its creators didn't anticipate, it becomes a variable rather than a tool. That's when monitoring begins. Ancient texts describe watchers beings who observe rather than rule. They don't intervene directly, they record, they measure, they wait. Only when thresholds are crossed does action follow. You don't have to take that literally to feel its relevance. Modern humanity is watched constantly. Satellites track our movements. Algorithms model our behavior. Data predicts unrest, consumption, migration. We are observed, categorized, optimized, not by gods, but by systems we built to manage ourselves. And that's where the parallel becomes unsettling. If the first humanity was erased because it exceeded control, and the second was shaped to be more manageable. Then what happens when manageability begins to fail again? This is the part of the story ancient writers couldn't have imagined in detail, but they circled the idea nonetheless. Cycles, ages, repeated destructions followed by renewals. Worlds that end not because of judgment, but because of imbalance. Fire, water, sky, earth. Each catastrophe corresponds to a different kind of excess. Today, the threats don't come wrapped in mythic language. They arrive as models and projections. Rising temperatures, feedback loops, tipping points, cascading failures. The vocabulary has changed, but the anxiety hasn't. And here's the most unsettling parallel of all. We are now capable of creating life ourselves, editing genes, designing organisms, simulating intelligence, running experiments that involve trial, error, and iteration. We talk openly about optimization, about versions, about deprecating old systems and deploying new ones. We've become eerily similar to the creators described in the ancient texts, which forces an uncomfortable mirror on the story of the first failure. Because if we judge our creations by utility, scalability, and control, we can't pretend we wouldn't consider resets under the right conditions. That doesn't mean anyone is planning one. It means the logic exists. And once logic exists, it tends to repeat. So the question becomes quieter, but heavier. Not are we being watched, but are we repeating the same pattern from the other side? If humanity 1.0 failed because it didn't understand the limits of its environment, then humanity 2.0 faces the same test only now. We are both the system and the variable. The ancient stories end without resolution for a reason. They weren't meant to predict the future. They were meant to warn the present, not with threats, with memory, because memory is the only thing that can interrupt a cycle. If this truly is the second version of humanity, then the reset already happened once. And if resets follow patterns rather than morals, then survival isn't about virtue. It's about awareness. As the night deepens, the questions you've been carrying don't demand answers anymore. They soften, they drift. Not because they've been resolved, but because they've found their place. You don't need to decide whether humanity was created once, twice, or not at all to feel the weight of the pattern. You only need to notice how often stories from different ages and cultures point to the same quiet fear that the world can end suddenly, and that survival is never guaranteed. The ancient writers pressed their memories into clay because forgetting was more dangerous than uncertainty. They didn't know about genetics or climate cycles or celestial mechanics, but they understood disruption. They understood that civilizations rise quickly and vanish just as fast. And they understood that whatever comes after is never quite the same as what came before. If there was a first version of humanity, it isn't gone entirely. It lingers in instincts, in the way we build monuments as if permanence might protect us, in the way we look to the sky when things feel unstable, in the way we measure, record, and repeat rituals that feel older than explanation. And if this is the second version, then perhaps the most important difference isn't what was changed in us but what was remembered. Memory doesn't shout, it whispers, it becomes intuition, a sense that growth needs restraint, that power needs structure, that survival depends on balance more than ambition. The ancient stories don't end with certainty because certainty was never the point. They end with continuity, with the understanding that history doesn't move in straight lines, but in cycles that can only be recognized after they've passed. So as your breathing slows and the world outside fades into background noise, you can let the mystery remain what it has always been, a mirror rather than a conclusion. Whether the creators were gods, forces of nature, or our own forgotten ancestors doesn't change the lesson. We are here because something survived, something learned, and something began again. If there is a test woven into our existence, it may not be about obedience or belief, but about awareness, about recognizing the patterns before they close into loops we can't escape. For now, that's enough. The questions can rest. The ancient tablets will still be there. The stones will still wait. And whatever the truth of our origins may be, it isn't finished revealing itself. Not yet.